When you share your story with others and they share theirs with you, barriers break down, heart and attitude shift, and healing begins. A very warm welcome to the second installation of the E-Lounge. If you are living in any of the Southern African countries, then you could be one of the over 50 million people who are familiar with Soul City, Soul Buddyz, and Heartlines. Well, today in our studio, we spent some time with South Africa's leading social entrepreneur, the co-founder of Soul City, the internationally acclaimed multimedia edutainment, Dr. Garth Japhet. Dr. Garth is a medical doctor who co-founded Soul City in the early 90s. He's also the founding CEO of Heartlines. Garth is a Shrub Fellow of the WEF, a Fellow of the African Leadership Initiative, and a Senior Ashoka Fellow, and has received a Global Everett Rogers Award for his contribution to entertainment education. Like Water is for Fish is his very first book. It is an account of a journey that led to Garth co-founding Soul City and Heartlines. It gives us an understanding into storytelling in its multiple forms. It's an essential tool for our lives as water is for fish. Insights and inspiration stimulate great conversation. The E-Lounge is one of our knowledge share platforms anchored on our values of learning and leadership. We do hope that you will tune in, engage, take away the knowledge from this great conversation. And remember, those who desire to lead should read. Thank you.
They say you don't share your light by illuminating the valleys. Light is shared by setting the mountain peaks alight, so that even those in the valleys can discover their surroundings. My author today has done exactly that. He's illuminated the peaks of a subject that we generally don't look at all. But he has spoken from the perspective of a medical doctor, an author, a change agent. He is the founder of the Soul City project and has come through ultimately to now talking about Heartlines. And he will tell us more what he's up to now. A man who probably by the end of today I'll call my friend, Dr. Garth Japhet. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Tsepo. I'm honored and delighted to be here. Thank you.
Garth, if we was to start, who is Garth Japhet? Beyond all this branding, you know, a lot of it is branding, you know.
A lot of it is branding. Yes. Not all of it is a lot of it is gloss.
Yes. Who is Garth Japhet?
So I would like to say, I think a lot of people, a good idea in your life is to say, what will they say at your funeral? And they won't be looking at your achievements. Yes. They will be looking at who you were. So I'd like to think that I am a good friend, that I am a father to 2 children, a husband, and somebody who cares deeply about our country, about our history. They say if you don't know your past, you can't plan a future. And hopefully making a contribution to our future. I am also privileged on many different levels. I'm privileged because I'm a white person who benefited a lot from the environment I grew up in. I'm privileged that I had a mother and a father, that they were able to afford a good education for me, and that I have been given talents which hopefully I am putting to use. So I don't know if that answers your question. I also am a maker of bubble machines.
Bubble machines?
Yes, I make bubble machines.
Okay.
For children's, I made one for my daughter's 21st on Friday.
Okay.
Yes, so I will share the secret with you at a later date.
I think I'm looking forward to it. Garth, in the beginning, you know, if we were to start about the growing up and it's that line, I am officially a nursery school dropout, that I was hooked. Once that line had been written in that book, I was hooked, and I'm intrigued. I'm always intrigued by people's, you know, the start when you were growing up, and you talk quite a lot about the relationship with your mother. Let's start there.
Yeah, as I say, I was you know, privileged. I grew up in a home with a mum and a dad, and I have 3 siblings, but they're much older than me. And so by the time I was sort of, you know, 6, 7, they had already really left home. And because my parents were a bit older, a lot of their friends' children were not my age. So I grew up very much a lone child. Grew up in my own world and had to, I suppose because of that, my imagination became honed. I loved books, I loved stories. I would, you know, disappear into stories. And I was quite afraid of the outside world because, in fact, I didn't have much contact with it. I was in this house with a garden and no real people around me. So going to nursery school was a huge trauma for me, because the safety of this bubble, which was my mother, which was this amazing woman who was, I know it sounds like this phrase everyone uses, second mother, but she really was a woman called Serena Mojapelo, and a gentleman called Benny Sabanda. They were my life. And so when I went to nursery school, just being separated from what was familiar to me was just too traumatic. And I think I lasted about 5 days at the nursery school. And then I became a nursery school dropout. And as I write in the book, that was the beginning of a bit of a pattern of dropping out of schools.
Dropping out of schools and then ultimately making it to being a medical doctor. It's like, it was one of those things that I couldn't connect. It's like, okay, you know, there's a bit where you speak about your father's disappointment about, you know, dropping out of one of the schools. But you don't speak much about the relationship between you and your father in the book much.
I don't, and you know, since I've written the book, and because of the work we're doing now, yes, which is called Fathers Matter, yes, I've become much more interested in that relationship. And on so many levels, I was blessed to have a father who, in his own way, really tried to be there for me. Maybe, you know, initially I didn't feel like that was true, but he had an absent father. And so he had no real role model of how to be a father. So he was a presence in my life, but also a generation where Dad would be at work and then come home and read the newspaper. And I don't remember him ever engaging with me about what was happening at school. I just, you know, I suppose deep within us as children is something we want to make our parents proud. And I think particularly our fathers, particularly I think as men, we want to make our dads proud if we're lucky enough to have them around. And so he was an interesting man. He, as I say, his father married 5 times, and he was one of 2. Okay. But he didn't really have a role model of what a dad was. But now, as I look back, I think he tried his best. Yes. Yeah.
No, everybody looks back at their dad and what do they call it, and that is why the book, the song "In the Living Years," it's such a powerful song. And as much as it's got a simple melody, but it's such a, you know, let's try and do it in the living years. But I want to ask you something that's important, and to me, the growing up context, and maybe something that, what do they call it? How does one grow up? As you say, privileged, white, and, you know, in a space where you've got a garden, you've got, you know, somebody who is your second mother and a gardener and all sorts of things. How do you end up being a conscious objector?
Well, I wasn't brave enough to be a conscious objector, but I was a liar in terms of getting out of the army, but that's another story. But and for that I thank my father. So my father was Jewish, and I think there's a very strong, within a lot of Jewish people, the concept of social justice. Mm-hmm. And so I grew up in an environment where I was very, through the 70s and 80s, very aware, because of the conversations in our household around what was going on in our country. And, it was very possible as a white person to have it was just what we were used to. Yes. And unless it was pointed out to you that this is not normal, this is wrong, it was what you grew up with. But in my context, my dad was very involved and was involved in the early 70s and things like in Alexandra Township, in setting up a youth center there, in a thing called the African Children's Feeding Scheme. And so he was the campaign manager for Helen Suzman in the Houghton area. So the concept of living in a society with great injustices was a gift that he gave me. And so I think that's why I perhaps was different to a lot of my peers who wasn't exposed to the injustices of our society.
Talking about that, I mean, a lot of people maybe they take the phrase conscious objector in its simplest form, and it's these are people who felt that going to conscription and ultimately fighting the war that was there in itself, it was an unfair thing for them to be asked to do. But you had a very clever way of getting out of it.
As I say, I don't know if it was clever. It was, I do think it takes bravery.
Yes.
To actually be a conscious objector, to go to jail, and I have huge, and it's the same as to be a freedom fighter, to actually take those risks. I don't have that bravery in me. But I also knew that I couldn't go to the army. Yes. And be part of a system that it just went against everything that I held dear. So I studied, and again, some people call it a minor miracle. I'd call it a major miracle that I actually got into medicine. I fainted at the sight of blood. I wasn't particularly good at maths or science. I get into medicine. But fortunately, because of that, I didn't have to go into the army after school. Yes. I then was a doctor already when it eventually was my time. I couldn't put it off any longer. In fact, I'd gone over to the UK to avoid conscription. And then I was sitting quite miserable at a pub in London with the grey sky. And we've talked about, Seppel, what that's like. And the announcement about the freeing of Nelson Mandela. Mm. And I had already got a job offer in Australia. I didn't want to go to Australia, but I didn't want to go back home and do the army either. And the announcement came that Nelson Mandela was going to be freed and the ANC was going to be unbanned. And I just decided in that pub I was going home. But still there was conscription. And fortunately, I'd had back trouble while I was a houseman, an intern doctor. And they'd done an X-ray, a sort of MRI, and wasn't there a CT scan. Mm. And they'd picked up something, which was what they call mild spinal stenosis, which is the spinal cord goes through the spinal column. Okay. And stenosis is when it's a bit tight. And as a result, the spinal cord gets a bit constricted, and you get pain, and ultimately it can lead to muscle failure and so on. And so I had this report that said he might have spinal stenosis. So I thought, okay, I'll go into the army, but I will say that I've got this thing, I can't possibly stay. And as a result, when I had my medical, I showed them this, and they said, oh, that's fine, but you need to stay, and you just need to be close to a hospital. And I thought, I've now got 2 years of this. And through another miracle, I then was able to say, whenever they said to me, as the corporals would say, sak for 20, which means, get down there and do your press. Oh, no, corporal, I can't, my back is too sore, etc. Or do this, do that. And eventually they sent me to an army neurologist.
Yes.
And he knew that I was lying. But he clearly saw what I was up to. And to my complete surprise, he said, you're going to need a serious operation. Here's your certificate out of the army. So I was in the army long enough to get a haircut for 2 weeks, and then I was discharged.
Talking about haircuts, you talk about what do they call it? I don't know what you refer to, the unhappiness that your mother never allowed you to have a haircut with the other kids in school, and you felt that there was too much protection on her part.
Yeah, I had a complicated relationship with my mother, who in her own right was a complicated, also came from a very broken family, was English. My father met her after the Second World War in the UK, and she was pretty much was an only child and came out here, was brought out by the South African, and this young English woman didn't know anyone. And she, for her own reasons and because of her own story, I was the last born.
Yeah.
And she became incredibly protective over me. And because I'm reasonably sensitive to people's feelings, I think as a child, my bond to her was quite an unhealthy one. Part of the reason I dropped out of nursery school. And a very good example of that was how she would protect me from, the school barber. I was the one kid who couldn't have his hair cut. Everybody else, the barber would come once a term, and you'd go and you'd have your hair cut. But my hair, I had to go bring a note. And as a young child, to bring the note, the only kid in the school who can't have his hair cut. But that was part of her relationship with me, which ultimately was very destructive, because it created severe separation anxiety for me, which then led to a range of circumstances that ultimately led me to dropping out of a range of schools, not because I was bullied. And strangely, knowing me, you asked me about me, if I'd been a bully, I'd have bullied me. But I was never bullied. I don't know why, but I was never bullied. And it was the reason I dropped out of these schools is just acute homesickness, no other reason. And so ended up, in 1 year, I dropped out of 3 schools in 1 year. Yeah.
But, Garth, with that intriguing, sense of homesickness and everything else, you seem to get into stuff without a plan. I mean, when you're in medical school, you go off to Hillbrow and you're helping out there, and out of nowhere, then you hatch this incredible plan to go and raise funds.
Yeah, so I think, again, maybe it's just something innate in one. But although I get extreme anxiety and still do, and have been on medication for years because of it, I'm very fortunate in that I believe that I can, if I can dream it, I can do it. And quite often I can't do it. But, I've got to learn about different people's personalities quite late in life. That there's a lot of people who will dream it and then they'll see all the obstacles in the way, and so they won't attempt it. And I am fortunate in that I dream it and don't worry too much about the obstacles.
No, you don't.
I sort of back myself to, I know that there will be obstacles, but a plan will be made, and I'm not sure what the plan is. And that, I think, is maybe, one of the things that I've been very blessed with is the ability to not worry too much around the roadmap, but to be sure of what I believe is the destination. And that, quite often, that you talk about was raising funds at the Market Theatre.
Yes.
When I was at medical school for this this clinic in Hillbrow for homeless children, or for street children, called the Twilight Clinic. And I decided that we needed to raise money so that I could actually get some medication so that we could actually run this clinic properly. And so decided, hey, people love the theatre. Let me book out the Market Theatre. And the Market Theatre in the 80s was protest theatre.
Yes.
You know, it was wonderful. It was, you know, if I was living in that environment, I just loved it because it was edgy. It was the time where, as you may remember, in the 80s was one of the few outlets that black people had in particular for protest. It was protest theatre. What I didn't figure out is that not every white person actually likes going to protest theatre. Not every white person likes being reminded of what's going on around them. So I took this theatre and then realized with like a week to go that I'd sold like 20 tickets to my family, to a few friends at medical school, and I was basically had responsibility for 600 tickets, and the Market Theatre required me as a student to pay them. So that's when, I then just have to say, guys, I've got a problem here. I don't know what the solution is. And that's where friends come in. And they started to sell tickets for me. Yeah.
And I want to explore that because, we all talk about, and especially in the time of COVID when people had been isolated for a very long time, the power of relationships. Because right there and there, every time you got yourself into something, there was always somebody there who was able to say, no, God, let's just do this. I mean,
who's got my back?
Who's got your back?
Yeah,
I mean, let's explore that. We talk about anxiety and talking about being alone and most of other things, but how much role does does it play to have not a lot of friends, but to have enough people around you who are always willing to help?
I think it's the huge role in life. And, you talk about leadership and having led Soul City for 17 years and then Heartlines now and looking, I think that if there's one thing that has helped me through is the relationships that I've had with my colleagues, not just my friends. And part of that, I think, is being vulnerable, is not always having it together. Being able to say, guys, we're in this together. I'm not entirely sure what we're going to do here. I need you to help me. And as I've often said to people, actually, what a lot of people perceive as a weakness is actually a strength. So when you go to your friends or your colleagues and say, guys, I need your help, there are very few human beings who actually will not take that as something. You need me. We like as human beings to feel like we're needed. Tsepo, I need your help, is something that actually is something that people respond to. And it's what makes us human, is that's what the true sense of community is. I mean, that word that is used so much, Ubuntu, is actually, it's about me helping you and you helping me. And when we help each other, we become truly human. And we form community.
We're going into winter now, and one of the things I learned from living, in the UK is that the highest rate of suicide in the UK occurs during the winter months. You've lived there, you go to work in the morning, it's dark, you come back, it's dark. And you actually literally, during the time when you've got hours of light, it's actually during the time when you're working. So you never get to really see the sun much. Now, in exploring this conversation of, us thinking about mental wellness as a whole, and we've been through a horrid 2 years, and the role that that relationships play in this sense, and for me that interests me because you've been through a lot of judgment. There's people that you've met that have judged you in a particular manner, but through all of that you've always been willing to help. Where does that come from?
I don't know. I think, again, I was fortunate to have a role model, again, actually, in my dad. And I must give him much more credit than I've actually given him in the book, which is that he was always willing to help. In fact, whether it was the person, had no food on the corner or his best friend who was going through a crisis. So I do think it comes from that. Interestingly enough, and we're talking about mental health and so on, I was so surprised with writing this book. It was not an objective of mine, which was to I wanted to talk about the power of story, about sharing your story, about getting to know your own story. But obviously in sharing my story, part of my story was the battle with mental health.
Yes.
And one of the things that has surprised me most about the reception of this book is the number of men who've reached out to me and said, you gave me permission to talk to people about my mental health, that I'm not coping, that I'm feeling depressed. And I think particularly men, women are better at this, at actually sharing our feelings. And as men, there's this concept of, we need to be tough. We need to be showing that we're coping. And, male suicides outweigh female suicides. And when men commit suicides, they do it properly. There's as in they kill themselves. Yes, And so I think this concept of friendship, of being vulnerable, of being where you're at, about saying when you are coping and when you're not coping, and being able to share that with each other, is certainly something that I'm hoping, men in particular will do more. And it's certainly where you say, well, coming all the way back to your question around helping is when we help others, we're actually helping ourselves. It's definitely a two-way street.
It is an intriguing way of viewing it. But we also know that, that soul searching is not simple. You yourself, the intriguing story that you tell is the one where you're sitting not far from here, up in Melville, at a world music festival, and into your second pint of beer you go, I'm a medical doctor now, what happens? Most people would have been happy right there and there, but not Garth.
Yeah, I think it tracks back to the reason I did medicine. So all my leanings were towards the arts. I was reasonably good at languages. I loved history. I didn't like the sciences. But because of that period where I dropped out of school 3 times, I felt a real failure, particularly to my dad. And at that stage, and I think rightly or wrongly still, the concept of, so what's your son doing? Oh, he's doing medicine. He's going to be a doctor. Is still rightly or wrongly, is something that people will say, Tsepo, what's your son doing? Oh, no, he's studying medicine. And that sounded just so much more amazing than he's just studying a BA at varsity or whatever. And so there was part of me that felt that Dr. Japhet was going to sound better than Mr. Japhet, and that would make my dad proud. But there was another strong part which was really about social justice and about feeling that medicine in some way would be able me to make a bigger difference to the continent and the people that I love than perhaps another career. And there was a series of books that I was reading as a teenager called The Jungle Doctor. And as I said, I lived in the world of books, and thank you for this initiative and about exposing people to the world of books, because it is it's such again, people talk about it, but there is a world in books, and one is able to travel to these worlds. And I was able to travel into this world of this guy who was a doctor in East Africa, Dr. Paul White. He was a missionary doctor. And the stories he told, they were children's books. I just would see myself as being that doctor and working in villages in Africa and helping rural people and things. And obviously then you go and study, and I ended up, first of all in KwaZulu-Natal, Edendale Hospital, in the environments that I'd dreamt about in my head, of being in a rural area, of helping people. And then, there was an all fall down and the 7-day war. And then I end up in Alex Township, at Alexandra Clinic, Masakani Clinic, as it became known through Soul City. And I felt suddenly that this world that this is what I dreamt of. This is the medicine I wanted to do. I didn't want to work in a private practice. I didn't want to be a professor or so. This was what I wanted to do, and yet I was profoundly depressed by it, because the situations that had created the problems,
Yes.
and as we know, not 10 k's from here is Alexandra Township, with sewage running in the streets, and children getting sick from that. And I realized that by just sitting in that clinic and seeing these kids coming in with burns, with diarrhea, with things that were created by the environment that they'd come from, where some little bit of knowledge might have helped. I just realized that so I became profoundly depressed by, is this all it's going to be? Because this is not what I wanted to do, but I don't know what I want to do. And, I think that they say if you don't have a vision, then you don't have hope.
Yes.
And I didn't have a vision. I know that when I don't have a vision, when I can't see a little bit about what my next step is profoundly depressing for me. And so it was at that time, sitting in this not far from here, that I was thinking, what am I going to do? This can't be it. And I suddenly had this brainwave of, I'd had this amazing thing where I'd begun already to think about communication and story. And I had gone, the editor, an extraordinary man who I had the privilege to call my friend, Dr. Agri Klaster, the founder of, he wasn't the founder, but he was the editor of the Sowetan, and it was a drum magazine. And because I was Dr. Japhet, and that's again, I wasn't Mr. Japhet, I was Dr. Japhet. I was able to fill up a phone up the Sowetan and saying, it's Dr. Japhet here from Alexandra Clinic. Can I have a meeting with Dr. Klaster? And because I was Dr. Japhet, and I came and I said, I'd like to write for you. I want to write information that will help those people living in Alex or Soweto or whatever, with information that will make a difference. And to his credit, and it was because of Agri that I got started, he said, fine. And I started writing this newspaper column.
Before we get there,
Yeah. I'm jumping ahead.
No, you're getting into another story that you took on without a plan again. that's the most intriguing thing about your story, is that it never
There
has
wasn't
a
a plan, you're right.
It was an idea,
Yeah.
but I have the pleasure of having had to look at it and go, I wish a lot of leaders were like this. You don't have a plan, but you have a vision. The role of spirituality. So you're muddling about with this idea of what's my next all the time. It's there, and then you create a plan and you have this sense that things will work out, or maybe you never have a sense that things will work out, but you're going to do this. Now, you've had an interesting relationship with the Midlands of KwaZulu-Natal. So at some point in time, you decide, look, after you graduated, you're going to sit at a spiritual retreat.
Yeah, a lot of, and that's the advantage of tracking back on your own story, is that a lot of my sort of so-called successes, if that's what they are, have come out of deep lows, periods of deep crisis in my own life. And, crises are relative. My crisis versus somebody who's just, lost their child is different, but everyone's crisis is different. But I had a crisis of purpose, and it was linked to this about I'd been in KwaZulu-Natal, I'd been exposed to this tremendous violence in what they called the 7-Day War, and suddenly ended up being a doctor responsible for refugees that had horrific injuries in the middle of nowhere up this Edendale Valley. And it was the tipping point where, having battled through medicine, even though it was what a lot of people said I shouldn't do, not loving the science of medicine, I'd ended up in this environment. And then this question of, I thought this was a career that I sort of had a belief that God was behind it, but I didn't know who God really was at that point. And yet, everything was a mess. And so I I did a few things, and I was deeply depressed. I didn't know it at the time, but I was deeply depressed. So I quit KwaZulu-Natal and came back to Joburg. And I did 3 things. I went to see a psychiatrist who told me I have severe depression and put me on medication, and have been on medication ever since. I went to a career counselor. I actually, for a week, gave up medicine and got into an MBA. I thought, no, I'm going to go and just get a real life here. And then the third thing I did was I went to see a priest.
Yes.
I said, because if you're looking for purpose, then you're asking questions about life. What's this all about? And as a doctor, you see life in the raw. You see babies being born, you see people dying, you see trauma, you see all sorts of things. And I was asking, what's this about? And the priest took me through a very cerebral, a very brain purpose around, why Christianity or Jesus was an intellectually, it wasn't intellectual suicide to believe. And so I made an intellectual decision. And he said, as part of this, I want you to go on a retreat. And I went to the Midlands. He sent me back to the Midlands, as you say. I went like full circle. And went to this place called Beth Shalom, which was a couple up in Hilton and outside of Maritzburg. And the amazing thing that happened there, because I thought I would go to a guru and I would sit down and he would analyze my life and he would tell me what to do and where to go and what to do. And when I got there, I was profoundly disappointed, because he said, I'll meet with you for half an hour a day just to check in. And for the rest of this week, you're by yourself. And you're by yourself and you're going to go and write your story. And you're also going to spend a bit of time on these verses. But I want you to write your own story. And it was the first time that I'd sat down and tracked back on my story and made some sense out of these tangled pieces about dropping out of school, my relationship with my mother, my relationship with God, my relationship with medicine. And in the book, I describe that experience of actually suddenly realizing that a lot of what I'd seen as complete mess, that there was purpose in it, and that out of the ashes was some things actually had been a success.
Coming out of COVID, and not probably coming out of COVID, but COVID sort of brought it to the forefront. Leadership and spirituality have always been divorced for a very long time. But through COVID, and one of the good outcomes of it, if there were ever any good outcomes of it, was that leadership and spirituality have started to wrestle with each other again and find each other and find friendship or find companionship. Maybe friendship is taking it too far. And a lot of leaders are asking themselves the role of spirituality. And what you're saying to me is that it's about finding self. Is that the way you found it to be, that you went looking for self and found God, or is it the other way around?
No, I think it was both. I mean, I think we're body, mind, and spirit, and if you have a belief that your life has a purpose,
Yes.
then understanding, it's a lovely picture, but a tapestry.
Yes.
When you create a tapestry, and from the front you see a lovely picture, but from the back you just see the tangled threads. If you turn a tapestry over, you see these threads, and it doesn't make any sense. And often we live our lives and all we see are these tangled threads, which are things that don't make sense.
Yes.
And we don't often take time to come back and reflect, which is trying to look a little bit at the picture. And so understanding that there actually was purpose, that things that I'd seen as great tragedy, or not tragedy, because I didn't have tragedy, but, when I'd let my parents down, that I'd dropped out of schools, that actually they had been the seeds of actually other things that actually I wouldn't swap now for anything.
That is profound, because you're talking about finding power in failure.
Yes, absolutely.
But we never talk about that.
No.
Garth, we never. Everybody talks about, the big fish stories, the big tall tales that we tell.
Stories.
The success stories and whatever they call it. But it's an intriguing one for you to say that, there's power in failure.
Absolutely. And I mean, I love work that has been done. So there's lots of work on story and about going back on your own story. And I'm going to produce a little companion that goes with this book about how to look at your own story. But there's a lovely thing, an example of where you actually trace your story on a piece of paper, and you look at the failures in your life, and those are your troughs. And then you look at your successes; those are the mountains. Those are the peaks. When you got the job, and when you married, or when you had the child, etc. These are but then you take the piece of paper and you turn it over, so that your
highs are down.
Your tragedies actually become those peaks. And the reality is that most people's successes are born out of failure. And to be able to embrace your failures and see what you've learned from it and what it gave birth to is tremendously empowering. And something that I think, which is why I'm very willing to be vulnerable about my failures, because they're the things that have actually allowed me to have, in worldly terms, successes. Without them, I wouldn't have created Soul City. Without a whole lot of failure that led to a crisis point where I was sitting on the pavement there thinking, I've really stuffed this up.
But and I want to go back to something that is important to this conversation, and the role of fathers, and the role of, what do they call it? And this is your latest project that you're working on now. When you look back to, what do they call it, to your father's story now, do you believe that played a very, very big part in one allowing yourself to be able to feel that challenge of failing? Because a lot of people, if you speak to them, they probably view it the other way around. Their inability to actually look at their failure and acknowledge it comes from them not being able or willing to disappoint their father.
Look, I think, one of the tragedies of our world, not just our country, is the number of kids who grow up without being affirmed, not necessarily by their father. We call it the active, positive presence of a man.
Yes.
It's often, and that's not to undermine the amazing role that those extraordinary women who've brought up amazing people have done. But the evidence is so clear that there is something innate in all of us that needs the approval of a significant man in your life, whether you're a man or a woman, is that the approval of a man in your life is really important to how you see yourself. And so, I think there is something deep in us that wants that approval. And I was craving that approval, which made me do, as I told you, part of the reason why I did medicine was because I wanted my dad's approval. But if I can just divert slightly to saying the power of not only knowing your own story, but actually learning the story of those closest to you. So actually, one of the things that I'm sad about is that once I understood the power of getting to know your story, I had the opportunity to sit down with my mother in her early 80s. And I sat with my phone and sitting like we are now, and I said, okay, Mum, I know bits of your story, but I want you to tell me your story. And don't tell me from when I was born. I want to know your earliest memories. And getting to know my mother's story enabled me to understand why that woman didn't want my haircut, why she overprotected me, and in many ways enabled me to forgive her for that, that being completely protective, which then had an impact on me. Knowing parts of my father's story about the fact that he'd never been fathered. He'd never been affirmed by his dad. Enabled me to understand him, and hopefully to not, the sins of the fathers are repeated on. And so this concept of getting to understand not only your own story, but those around you, your grandparents, your parents, gives you huge insight into yourself and enables you maybe to break patterns, to forgive, and so on.
I want to dwell a little bit on this issue, and because for me it's intriguing, and I'm sitting here and I'm almost projecting out my own life and looking at it, and I'm finding that there's a lot of similarities in what they call it in our story. But I will tell my story one day. Today we're telling yours. so for me,
we'll just swap chairs.
We'll just swap chairs. That ability to be able to say, let me tell my story. And I wrote here, what did God find in Mooi River? When he went to Beth Shalom, what did he find? But now I realize that you found God, and in that you also found, your spirituality. You found the relationship with everything else that was in and around you. But let's talk about this. I mean, this is the title of the book. Like water is for fish. And like water is for fish, God says stories are to people like water is for fish. And that's intriguing, because fish cannot live without water. And so human beings cannot live without telling their stories. But God, here am I, and I'm saying to you, I'm challenging you, it is not the South African way. South African men don't tell their stories. How do we start to teach?
Well, we start off by doing what we're doing right now, and realizing that vulnerability is not weakness. Vulnerability is leadership. We've been through some very rough times, both at Soul City and at Heartlines. And by being that remote leader who has it all together, which is the pattern of leadership that a lot of us have been taught. You're the guy who's got it together. It's not about not taking responsibility. I take responsibility for leadership, be it in my home or with my friends or whatever. But by showing vulnerability, we are enabling others to show their vulnerability too. And I think, if we look at quite a lot of things that have gone wrong in our society, I think many people who have been placed into positions where they really don't really know what to do, but feel that if they actually reach out and say, I don't know what to do here, but I'll find somebody who can help me, that shows weakness. And, if I've learned anything over the years of, I don't know how to produce a television series. I don't know anything. I mean, now I sort of know this environment. Yes. But when I started, I didn't know anything. But I knew that there were people who knew a lot more than me, and that I could call upon them for help. So I think, not just as men, but as South Africans, if we could draw on the wisdom and the skills that we've got in our country, and not feel that shows weakness, that's true leadership. When you acknowledge what you don't know and reach out for help to people who do. So maybe that's my message, is actually true vulnerability as South Africans, as men, is to be a little bit more comfortable with saying, actually, I don't know, or I've failed here and I need your help.
But here am I sitting here, or somebody listening at us right now, Garth, and saying, I am worried about being judged. And I want to tell a little bit of your story, about you traveling through Ireland and, as a white South African male, just in the middle of what do they call it, or almost at the end of apartheid. And then again, you being judged while you were doing some of your best work and being in Masakandi Clinic, and one of the medical managers walked in and gave you, what do they call it, a dressing down. Let's tell the story first, and then we'll come back to what do they call it.
Two different stories there.
Yes.
I mean, the Irish story was an interesting one. I actually was still a student. Is that it was in the middle of the 80s, which was, the focus of a lot of the world was on South Africa. Finally the world had woken up to the fact that apartheid cannot continue. We need to. But what happened to me in traveling was that when I was backpacking in Ireland, backpack and you take a bus and you hitch and things, is that when I introduced myself as Garth, and then we'd be chatting and you'd be from Germany or whatever, and then they'd say, "Oh, really? Where are you from?" And I said, "Well, I'm from South Africa." And in the one place, the youth hostel, they refused to sleep in the same bedroom as me. They said, "Either you go or we go. We won't stay with a racist." And then a few days later, I was hitchhiking in the middle of nowhere. I'd got in the rain, got this thing, and I was nowhere. And thankfully, this car arrived. I get in, it's warm, and we get chatting. He said, "Oh, well, where are you from?" I said, "Well, I'm from South Africa." Foot on the pedal, get out of my car. And at that stage, as a young person, I didn't make the connection about what it feels like to be discriminated, not on the basis of knowing who you are and what you are, but simply what you look like and where you come from, which was the experience of black South Africans growing up in South Africa, which is based on the fact that you're black. We won't even get to know you as Tsepo, but you're a black male, and that means you can't live here, you can't marry my daughter, etc., etc., etc. And the experience of we as human beings do it all the time, and we still do it, is that, based on what somebody looks like, the color of their skin, whether they're wearing a turban or not, the language they speak, we immediately put them into a box. And we say, well, that, because Tsepo is a black male, that means he's X, Y, and Z. Because Garth is a middle class, this is who he is. And, thing that we've discovered through Heartlines, this program we have called What's Your Story, which the power of actually saying, stepping back a bit and saying, no, wait a minute, I'm going to find out a little bit more. Tsepo, where does your name come from? Being, the wonderful Zulu word of sawubona, that beautiful greeting is that I see you. And I see you means that I actually see you as a person, and because of that, I want to be interested in not just your CV, but a little bit more about who you are. So I learned a lot about discrimination, about stereotyping, and about suddenly being a victim of that. It was only in later years that I understood it.
But Garth, being vulnerable, everybody's worried about being judged.
Yeah.
And this is probably the pivot point at which everybody, we can't seem to move the needle on the issue of telling their own stories. Now, what advice can we give? And beyond being able to say, well, I have to experience that. So, for instance, I used to live in England.
Yeah.
And I know what it feels like to experience xenophobia.
Yeah.
So I am, what do they call it? I am very sensitive to it.
Yeah.
It's one of those things that I have an issue with through and through, because I have felt what it feels like to be to walk through town being the only black person in town for the entire day and have people look at you as if like you are sick or something. It's like, because they have never ever met a black person before. And then also to have my colleagues tell me, oh, you are here to take our jobs. So I have a sense of that. And you talking about bias and being judged. And a lot of people can't tell their story because they are afraid of being judged. So how do we get past that point?
And it's the question you keep on asking, and rightly so, and I don't know what the complete answer to that is, other than it takes courage. And I think that our worry about being judged is often misfounded. Is that I've found, and I think my colleagues have found, because we've done this a lot now. Yes. We've done, we've worked with, 30 or 40 companies. We've run this in, 5,000 churches, in schools. This concept of getting to know each other's stories and listening is that people become surprised at just how liberating it is for them, but how the how little people actually have judged and saying, actually, you've given me the courage to actually say, I was abused as a child. And I've never had the opportunity to say that. And my advice when my kids or whatever asked me, and they said, well, my son was he was one of the only people to do an Easter thing where they were sort of doing the Passion in assembly. And he said, Dad, he said to me last week, he said, Dad, after assembly, no one clapped. And I felt very vulnerable. And I felt, what would people think of me? And I said, well, the people who think poorly of you because of the fact that you put your head up and you did what you did, are those really people that you want the respect from? Does their judgment matter that much to you? Because are they really the sort of people that you would want to have as friends? Is that, the people that we want to be admired by, the people that we want to be remembered by, those are the sort of people that won't judge us for being honest with who we are.
So, and I want to go back to something, and we will keep on going back and forth with it, because a lot of us have father issues. A lot of us have mother issues. A lot of us have never, and at times when I'm a bit irritated, people are that, I'm not going to be dwelling on issues of people who were not held enough as babies, because you can sense it. Somebody's not dealing with something because it's a problem. They're dealing with it because they're looking for acknowledgement and most of other things. Now, you're talking about being vulnerable. You're talking about, now these father issues are also, they've become what has become entrenched in us, in the sense that, I don't want to be judged. I don't want to be, I want to always be given praise and also other things, because we are starved of it. And the project we're talking about, Fathers Matter, is an important one, because we got to make that connection. Because most people don't make a connection with the fact that the way they react, the way they lead people, is all based on how not they were raised, but their perception of how their childhood was. And to me, that judgment and being vulnerable still remains one of those things. Because I sit here and says, we all have father issues, we all have the way we were raised. How do we make it past this?
Well, one is, as I say, is that very few of us, and this is part of, one of the things that we're doing and the companion that I'm going to do for is that very few of us have actually sat down and reflected properly on our own story and had an opportunity to accept, like my dad was never there, to forgive him. I'm not in my case, I'm just saying theoretically, that my dad beat the hell out of my mother. Yes. And that's why, I've always been afraid of other men, is that unless we can actually look back at those things, to forgive, to understand, we can't move forward. And so a lot of our sort of way in which we respond comes out of this. But we can't change that unless we go back, make peace with it, and say, actually, these are the good things that came out of my childhood. Because amazing stories that my colleagues tell around growing up without fathers or without food in the house, and the men they've become or the women they've become today. And instead of seeing those events in their lives as being complete and utter tragedy, they're now able to see them as something that has shaped them. And they've been able to take good stuff out of it. So I still come back to this thing of to move, it's like our country, is that if we cannot move our country forward unless we acknowledge our past. This concept of, we just must move forward. We don't dwell in our past. Just like I don't dwell in the fact that I was this, kid who couldn't leave home. I look at it, I acknowledge it, and I understand that, yes, it caused trauma in my life. But because of it, there are also things that are good that have come out of that. And in the same way, as a person, as a country, we don't dwell in our past, but we acknowledge where we come from, and we see and we forgive and we take the best out of that and say, these are some of the things that we've learned that has made us who we are today. So we're a tremendously resilient country because of that. I mean, I'd like us to be, less resilient because of our trauma. So I come back to this thing of actually spending an hour, a morning with a book and writing your story. Literally writing everything that you remember. And then taking a piece of paper and saying, these were the lows and then turning over the paper and saying, actually, those things, the time that I was abused, the time that, one of my colleagues' father was shot dead in front of him. It was a pivotal moment in his life. But it led to him being able to come alongside people in a way that he would never have been able to if he hadn't had that trauma.
I want to ask you, and talking about that, is that one of the things that intrigues me about your story is you don't give up that easily. You always go into things without a plan. I mean, you flew off and went to Kenya and to go and try and be a jungle doctor there. But you just have this, when you went to Kenya and you got there and you meet Mama Docturi, Dr. Spuri, and you fly off with her to the border with they call it, with Somalia and all stuff other things, and you engage but everywhere you've been, there's always things that are not all there. You're looking for this, medication for malaria, you're looking for that, and it's all there. But most people would break, Gada. I want to be able to understand where you get this inspiration from, because in the midst of darkness, you are able to cultivate hope beyond that, and that is something that we almost have to try and bottle and sell, especially in this country where there's so much of a need. You can get overwhelmed by the need.
Look, I mean, I think, first of all, if I was to do a talk at a school, I would make it a 1-minute talk, and it would have 3 words: never give up, never give up, and never give up. Because I think that we do give up too easily. So I think I'm also fortunate in that whether some people are artists, some people can sing, and some people are given a gift, which in my case is that I have perseverance. But I think you can learn these things. So some people have it as an innate gift, which I think I have, but I think you can also learn them. And I think that the concept of drilling into our young people, our old people, this concept of don't give up, because, I like I tell the story, I think it's a very bad story, but it's a story of, what happens, elephants, when they're going to drink, and they know, they know where the water is, and that herd just goes through the bush, and it will crash through things, and these are minor obstacles, but occasionally they'll come up against a tree that they can't push down, the big baobab trees or whatever. Now, in life, that getting to the water is their objective. What they don't do is that they don't say, well, I got to a tree, I can't push this one down, so I'm giving up. I'm just going to sit here and I'm not going to drink anymore. Is that they go around the tree. So they change direction. They don't give up on their dream of getting to the water. So a lot of, for me, has been about saying, I want to get from Joburg to Cape Town. Cape Town's my vision, is my destination. And I thought I was going to go down this road. But there are roadworks in that thing. I get there, I don't turn back. I look and I think, well, maybe I must go across here. I use an analogy which was given to me about looking for the next cat's eye in the road. When on a misty road, those things in our headlights. And we know that the destination is somewhere out there. But sometimes we don't know. We can only look for another step. So I think a lot of not giving up is about saying, well, all I need to do is, so what do I do next? I'm not going to give up on this dream. But maybe what I thought I was going to be, this big obstacle in the way, maybe there's something I can do in the meantime, and taking the small steps that eventually take me forward. So I think if I reflect back, that's often what I've done is when there's a big obstacle to the dream, I haven't given up on the dream. I've just said there must be another way. And even if I don't find it immediately, I think, well, what else can I do in the meantime? So, yeah.
And that intrigues me, because in the same story of what do they call you in 50 years buggering off to what do they call it to Kenya, you say something interesting, because and I've been in that sweltering heat in what do they call it in that area of the world. You say the journey is as important as the destination. But we never have this conversation. I mean, I've seen people who... The reason probably we have such a high death rate on our roads is that most people don't have the sense of enjoying...
The journey.
The journey. They're all about the destination, and everybody has to drive so quickly down there if they're going down to Devon that they forget that, enjoy yourself. I mean, I was once caught up behind these trucks that protest on the freeway, and it took me 12 hours to get down to Devon. But between myself and my brother-in-law, we have an incredible story to tell about that day. Is there a way in which we could actually be able, in getting people to tell their story? Is this an important lesson, that the journey is as important as the destination?
Yeah, it is. I mean, I think, this, and I think it's a very important lesson for us who live in an instant world. We want stuff instantaneously. We want instant coffee and fast food, and we want to make it in our careers or whatever. And as we know, when you get a bit older, is that when you get to those things, you still haven't made it. Is that there's always something else. You'll never get to a point of actually saying, well, I've made it, I've achieved, I've got there. And so those pieces along the way, those troughs and what we learn from them are as important as getting to the end goal. And that's why, again, I sort of say this concept of actually sitting down, particularly if you're middle-aged or a young person, you don't know what you've achieved in your life. I think a lot of middle-aged people get to a point and they're saying, what have I done? I haven't, actually you've done a lot. And that's why it's important to look at your journey and understand that the destination isn't actually a destination. There are lots of little waypoints. And actually, this conversation for me is one of them. This is part of our journey, is you and I having a chat.
To me, what intrigues me about this is that most people, when they end up with a midlife crisis, they buy a sports car. You started a new program. and to me, that is the level of resilience that I actually want us to tell the story about, And as we were having the conversation, I'm getting insights about the fact that we have to tell our own stories. Now, you started a program as you continued with Heartlines, as you moved off from Soul City and continued with Heartlines, where in your office you actually have a day when somebody tells their own story. And I found that intriguing, because that is the level of vulnerability that will build a team. But to just get over that hill of the first person who tells their story.
Well, that's, the history of that's interesting, is that we, felt very strongly as an organization, as we went through 94.
Yes.
And we had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which dealt with a few high-profile cases. But the reality is that we, black and white, are still dealing with big scars from 300 years. I mean, you can't just wipe that under the table. And these bringing in the consultant to do diversity and inclusion and racism workshops I don't think is the answer. We needed to find something that every person could do. If I really actually say, you know what, I want to reach out. I want to, as a white person, I want to be able to say, look, I take responsibility. I wasn't the architect, but I was the beneficiary. How do we go about that without saying, okay, Tsepo, you and I, we're going to have a conversation about race? Yeah. Immediately you go like, okay, yeah, all right. So we looked around the world at different had anything been done in these places of conflict, Palestine, Israel, Northern Ireland, that enabled people to, at scale, lots of people to have this conversation without having professionals? Couldn't find anything. And I don't know whose idea it was, but we began this concept in our offices where, and I think I started it, is told my story. And then, because I told my story and was vulnerable in my story, a lot of people were able to relate to me, not just as Garth, who'd founded Soul City and was a doctor, but as a guy who struggles with mental health issues, who's had a breakdown, who's on medication, who dropped out of schools. That made me human to people I work with. It didn't take away their respect for me. In fact, it gave them more respect. And we said, listen, okay, let's start doing this weekly. And people didn't have to, you can share what you want. You don't have to say I was, day one, I say I was abused as a child. And the more people shared, the more we saw things shift in our organization. Because suddenly, as much as we like each other and we're colleagues, we still had stereotypes. Well, because you are this, I think that's your story. And then, I would never have thought that. We do things like, we've built these tools over the years now. We do something called the race of life. If we do it where we all start off on the start line, and then we say, if you had a TV in your house, you take a step forward. If you didn't, you take a step back. Yeah. If you had books in your house, you take a step forward. If you didn't, you take a step back. If you had a mother and father in the house, you take a step forward. If you didn't, you have a step back. And so on. And there's the finish line. And then we stop it after 20 questions. And then you look around you. Some people are actually behind the start line. And other people are close to the finish line. And you would think that it would be the people you thought were privileged who would be at the front. And those that you thought through history, because of, all the black guys will be at the back and all the white guys will be at the front. And yeah, to a degree that's true. But there were some white guys sitting at the back, and there were some black guys right at the front. And this is our stereotypes, and as we began to unpick them, it's just created this completely different dynamic, where we see each other as fellow human beings who have different histories. So it's been extraordinary, and the power, we're doing workshops down in KZN now, with after the riots there. And we've brought together, we take a 2-day workshop where we bring together leaders from these different communities. And we say, leave the trauma at the door. And 30 people get together, leaders, and they tell their stories. And not the story of the riots, but the story of who they are and of their communities and from where they've come from. And the unbelievable healing that comes out of that process is quite extraordinary. Yeah.
I am intrigued by this, the bit where people tell their stories, the journey in itself, and that to me is something that probably we will engage upon, and I'd like to see it, because you're right. It's always never the person who you think.
Yeah.
Or because your bias is like, okay, Tsepo has made it there, and all sorts of other things. So that means this and that. I told you my story about when I arrived at university, what do they call it, in KZN, and what happened. And everybody would have assumed like it was just smooth sailing and everything else. But that's the story for another day.
But there are ways of doing that, and we've got lovely tools. You can bring a picture.
Yes.
You just say, okay, bring an object that is special to you and talk about that object. And out of that object, it might be a picture of your mother. It might be your favorite football. Out of that object, people are able to build their stories. So lots of wonderful techniques. And ultimately, why the book is called Like Water is Fit for Fish, because we are storytelling animals, is that we are, since we came out of the cave, deeply within our genetic makeup, the way God has created us is as storytelling people. And if I want to learn about who Tsepo is, then I need to know his story.
But out of your, out of your challenges with mental health, you've built, incredible business, you've built, you've told incredible stories, and you've had an impact on on society that goes beyond. I mean, it'll be for years when somebody asked me today and said, "Who's Garth Japhet?" And I said, "That's the guy who came up with the Soul City and Heartlines." And they said, "Oh wow, was that so?" And then we started discussing, a little bit about the story, and they were intrigued, and they said to me, "No, I'll definitely sit down and listen today," because suddenly it's like, the face behind the story. But a lot of people struggle with the fact that, if they speak about mental health, one is they're going to be judged. And then two is that requires them to be vulnerable. And that's not our South African way.
It isn't.
We are raised to stand up and be counted, and that means having that strength face and, being able to just openly cry is not our thing. And then it's not a men thing. It's generally a leadership thing in South Africa. How do we break that down?
Well, I think we break it down by example. It's not do what I say, it's do what I do. And ultimately, hopefully, one of the things that, again, surprised me about this book was people said, "Oh, you were so vulnerable." Oh, was I? Oh. But I think it's by realizing, and I can only tell you from my own experience, that my vulnerability has been one of my greatest strengths, is that there's no person who actually respects me less. In fact, I think, that if there is any respect, it's because people are saying they admire the fact. And the fact that particularly men have said you opened up about your mental health issues. And I, as a doctor, am particularly interested in trying to destigmatize mental health. Because, a diabetic doesn't say, "Oh, don't tell anyone I'm a diabetic," or "I've got high blood pressure." This is a biological thing. And just like a diabetic says, "Oh, well, I don't need insulin, I'll just pull myself together," or somebody with high blood pressure says, "I just will think it better," is the same with mental health, is that there are certain mental health things that are and thank God, and I do thank God, that there is medication, there's treatment. And in this very stressed world of ours, the not being able to reach out, and be vulnerable with each other. That, you coming back to COVID, is what, just coming back to COVID, because I think it's very interesting, is that the concept, I think that life is not going to throw us lemons, that we've got it under control. As long as we've got some money in the bank and we've got a job, then no trauma will happen. Actually, life is very fragile. And the only thing that really counts is our relationships, actually. Coming all the way back to this thing. When they, at the funeral, they say, "Well, Tsepo, had a great career," but that'll be 1 minute. They will then spend the next hour talking about you as the friend, as the guy who helped as a father, as a husband. So this is the important stuff. And as men, if we've got to have courage to be a bit more vulnerable. And I think that's where my message is, actually, you've got to have courage. If you want to be a brave man, then be vulnerable. Because that takes bravery. Yeah.
Tell your story.
Tell your story.
Tell your story.
And first, own your story. Get to grips with it. Celebrate the hard parts. Forgive yourself. Forgive others. Learn from it. And be prepared to tell your story.
That's incredible insight, in the sense that leadership, in its sense, it goes beyond courage. When you're talking about authentic leadership, it's about you being there fully and being present. And you can't be present if, one, you're not willing to listen, and two, you're not willing to tell your own story. And that to me, I find it to be very challenging.
And as I can say, is actually being vulnerable enough to say, "I don't know, and I need help." Because, as I say, I think a lot of what goes wrong is because people don't want to show vulnerability in leadership and say, "You know what, I'm out of my depth here. I actually don't know. I'm about to make a film. I don't know how to make a film. I've said we're going to make a film." Is that I think a lot of people, not just post-94, but just as people, are taking on roles and then finding that they don't know what. And that's fine. There's no problem with that, as long as you're vulnerable enough. And that takes courage, and that's leadership. Leadership is about saying sometimes, I don't know.
But Garth, here am I. I'm sitting here and I'm looking at, what do they call it? I am a black leader in some organization. And I've had, grievances brought against me, and some people have called me racist and all sorts of other things. And I'm sitting here and I'm going, all this trauma that I've had. And I go back to your story. I mean, with the medical manager who, just because they walked in, so a black man there with a bullet wound in the back of their head, and you did what you could with the circumstances that you had, and them calling you, in an implied form, a racist. I've got a black person here who's now reflecting on that and going, but how does this man not give up? Because some of these incidences, they do break you.
Again, and I think to a degree that's where my faith or understanding of, is that I'm not just accountable to you. I'm accountable, and just because you've called me a racist, I need to look in the mirror and say, in some cases, criticism is valid. I knew what was in my heart that evening, and I knew the circumstances I was in, and I knew that his criticism of me was not valid. But even if it had been, that might have been a learning opportunity. But this concept of others judging me, I'm much more concerned about, when I meet my maker. And he says, there's this parable of, I've given you these talents, what did you do with them? And I've been given a lot. And I think this thing about to whom much is given, much is expected. So having some obstacles along the way, being called a racist or whatever, the two things there, A, was it valid? In that particular case, it wasn't. Can I be a racist? Yeah, I think we're human. But in that particular case, no, I wasn't. It wasn't. That's not the reason I made that decision. That was the one thing. But the second thing was, that did not destroy a much bigger vision. And many other people who'd been wonderful to me. I talk about Sister Teresa, who was this extraordinary, mother figure who ran the pediatric clinic. She was amazing. And I loved working with her. So if every black person in that clinic had been nasty to me and said, why are you working in Alex? Get out of here, you white guy. But it wasn't that at all. So again, it was context.
And I think one of the intriguing stories that actually touched me at a personal level, when you tell it in the book. So when you started the process of the Heartlines, and again without a plan, and you go on stage and you start being vulnerable and you tell people about all of this. And there's a gentleman in the crowd who ultimately you end up having, coffee and cake with them. And a lot of professionals don't talk about their mental health issues because, one is, to advance, you don't want people thinking that, there's 1, 2 screws not there in your head and all of that. But how do professionals start to be vulnerable in and around the whole issues of mental health? How does one balance your need to advance?
Look, it doesn't define me. And I think that's, the different thing of saying, actually, hi, I'm Garth, I've got a mental illness. That's not what I'm talking about here.
Yes.
It's, I'm Garth, I'm a doctor, I've got these qualifications, this is my background. And in the course of that, if you're wanting to hear more about my life, I've got 2 kids, etc. I'm not going to necessarily upfront say, listen, by the way, I'm on. It's like saying diabetics don't in a job interview say, oh, by the way, I'm diabetic. But absolutely, if I'm asked about anything to do with my story or where I come from, or tell me a little bit more than your CV, I'll talk about my mental health because that's part of who I am. It's part of what's shaped me. It doesn't define me, And the reason it doesn't define me is that I've embraced it, and, I will, just like a diabetic doesn't say, well, listen, I won't keep insulin in the fridge at work,
Yes.
just in case somebody finds out I'm a diabetic. So I'd rather just not have insulin. I'd rather end up in hospital than let anybody know I've got insulin. So I think this thing about balance, about saying, I don't say, hello, it's not like, hello, I'm Garth and I'm an alcoholic.
Yes.
It's about saying, yeah, that's part of my story, and I'm happy to share it, but it's not who I am. It's part of who I am. It's a piece of my story.
But Garth, I still take you back to the fact that a lot of us have father issues and, mother issues and all sorts of other things. And that approval that we seek from other people actually comes way back from the back. And we always have to be able to talk about these things and say, but what I'm taking as an insight from this is you're saying, tell your story.
Mm.
First, be honest about your story. Because a lot of people also, when they tell their story, they tell the beautiful bits.
Mm.
And they never tell the story of what do they call it, it's amazing how many people we interview, and I get to a point where I go, have you ever had a project that went wrong?
Mm. Yeah.
You see the discomfort that just comes up.
Yeah.
Just right there and there.
Because actually you would rather know about that and what you did. I'd rather know about what happened as a result of failure. How did you deal with that? Because that shows the real character of the person.
But that is not the world we are raised in.
It's not.
And the healing of South Africa has to come with us being able to tell that story from that end.
Yeah. And, I think the other thing about an instant world is that I use this analogy around we don't, in the past, people would plant trees and expect that they would never grow under them, they would never sit under their shade.
Yes.
You'd create a little acorn in the ground and then but my kids and their kids might. And that was okay.
Mm-hmm.
Is that we're not going to change this country tomorrow. And we're not going to change men and the way we're vulnerable tomorrow. It may take the next 2 generations, I don't know. But this conversation is part of that change. So
my previous guest spoke about planting trees that you'd never sit under their shade, or digging wells that will never quench your thirst.
Yeah.
Now, you never sought out to be able to create legacy. You sought out to create impact and change lives.
Yeah, I and also to, and the reality was to show that I wasn't a failure, that, and even though, and now I'm able to look at my failures and see those as high points, actually.
Yes.
So, yeah, I suppose I don't know if many young people set out to create a legacy. I wanted to make a difference. And I didn't know what that looked like. And I wanted to make a difference for whatever reason, whether it was because of that deep bond that I had with those 2 amazing people who I spent more time with than my own mother growing up.
Yes.
I feel a deep affinity, not in a kumbaya sort of way, with the people of Africa. And I may be white, but I feel much greater affinity. You go to the UK, if you and I met in the UK, I would have a much greater affinity with you than 98% of the other people there.
Yes.
And that's because we've got a common story. Is that our stories, even though they're different, there's so many touch points. I know exactly, I can imagine you going to the old Bophuthatswana. I know where you grew up. I know where you went to, I can imagine you going to university and that time and they said to you, our quota's full. There's a depth there. So
it's intriguing that you talk about that. When I worked in the UK, in the middle of what they call a lot of Leeds, we were building the extension to one of the platforms. So I'm there as the consultant to come and check what's going on. And in the back of the whole busy side, I can hear this one guy swearing in Afrikaans. And I'm going, okay, I need to go and see what's going on there. And I get there, and, you know, everybody was just not terrified of this guy, but this guy, you know, typical South African construction manager, he needed to get that platform down. He was fluking his way through all of this. And I woke up there and I greet him in Afrikaans. All of those people on site saw this guy differently after I had spoken to him. Because we had a long conversation there about home, about all sorts of other things. But we had the same story. It might be from different parts of what they call it, of South Africa, but we had the same story. And because we had that affinity about being from here, both of us could relate to places he knows and I know and everything else. And that's an intriguing thing to tell what they call it about this. I'm still looking at whether we're getting any questions about what they call it, about today's. But I know when a subject is as intriguing as what we're talking about today, it tends to take a while. Like people wake up towards the end of the show and start asking questions about it. Now, you talk and you spoke about it a little bit right in the beginning, and saying you were also inspired. So you've done work in churches. What do they call it? You've had, you know, priests asking you, "Are you sure, God, this is going to work out?" Kind of a thing with the work that you've done. But the probably the most important story to you was the one of you sitting down with your mother. Now, a lot of people never get that chance to be able to sit down with their parents and have the conversation about where they grew up. And, you know, we know parts of the story as it is. And for you, what were the insights that go beyond, you know?
Well, it was a sadness that I'd never done it with my dad.
Okay.
Because he had passed by then. And even for our family, the fact that I was able to record her story was lots of parts. And I had to probe because it was a generation that didn't want to talk about themselves.
Yes.
You know, and still I think we live with a generation like that. But I think the very fact, you know, one of the amazing things about asking somebody a little bit more about their story is that it shows you that you're interested in them as a person. Not about what they can do for you, or for, it is about saying, I see you. And so the very fact that I sat down with my mother, even though she resisted, and said, "No," she's, "No, there's nothing to tell. You know, I was born here, met your father, had you guys, that's my story." I said, "No, Mama, that's not your story. Let's track back a bit." And, you know, then spent 3-4 hours with this, and just giving me, you know, when you talk about the wounds that we have as with our parents, giving me insight into why she did what she did, or was what she was, and the impact it had on me, enabled me to understand myself better. So that was the biggest sort of, and to understand her relationship with my dad. So a number of things. One is that it's a story that I'm able to now tell my children, because they didn't know my mother very well. It's a story that they will be able to tell their children. And ultimately, you know, in the past, that we would live in a place, in you know, where the grandmother and the mother and the children and the great-grandmother would all be in the same house. And you would know there would be this continuity. And yet now we're fragmented. So that was a huge thing for me, and certainly something that I encourage people to do. We always think there'll be time. You know, and COVID showed us you don't know when somebody's going to die. You know? No,
that definitely is what they call it. COVID showed us then, and as I'm sitting here, I'm thinking, you know, there's a lot of people that are out there listening to us, and they're thinking, and there are people who will continue to take the journey with us, later when the recording is put online and everything else. And they're sitting there and going, but how do I start this?
So you can go onto our Heartlines website, and we've got a little resource about how to engage in your parents' story.
Okay.
But it's just an online resource. It's free.
Yes.
There's lots of resources around how to tell your story and how to ask other people their stories. But the key thing is that, we're human beings. It doesn't have to be hard. It's literally about me sitting down and saying, hey, Tsepo, if you were my dad, I'd be saying, hey, Tsepo, Dad, where were you born? I mean, I know you told me but tell me a little bit about what it was like growing up. Tell me about where you went to school. What did you like doing? Did you have any problems at school? Were you ever bullied? Ask questions. So asking stories, getting people's stories is really about being interested. And one of the things we call this What's Your Story? 3 simple things to remember. We call it ask, listen, tell. We say, and make it a habit. So wherever I go, in whether it is a deep sit down or whether it's just, is be prepared to ask somebody more about their story. The second and perhaps the most important part is listening. Is that, it's very easy to ask, but to really listen, not to judge, not to try and solve their problems, because a lot of people have hectic stories. I'm unemployed and this happened to me. That's the other thing about telling a story is, also tell some of the good parts of your story. Some people are like that. They'll just tell you the bad parts. But what did you enjoy? But to be able to be present with them, to actually look and be present. And is so when you're listening to your parents' story, is just to be listening. Not to criticize or why didn't you? And then this concept of tell is be prepared to look at your own story, to engage, to spend that half an hour or a day or a morning writing down your story, looking at it, thinking about it. And then when people ask you your story, you can tell them as much or as little as you want, but being prepared to tell, because actually when I tell you my story, I'm giving you a gift, because I'm giving you permission to tell some of your own story or to be vulnerable,
But God, I still say to you, South Africa needs a lot more healing. And one of the things I'm taking away from today is that we cannot just brush away our story as a nation. We actually need to tell it more. And those that are saying, no, but, it's been 27 years, can we let go of the story? Actually are on the wrong track. The reason why what do they call it? We probably have a recurring story that doesn't end. We seem to be getting better and then fall down again. It's because we don't know where we come from. There's a what do they call it? There's an old cultural story that told that the reason why the Nguni thorn tree has 2 thorns next to each other that don't face the same direction and are not the same size is the fact that the one faces back is smaller, and then the one that faces forward is much longer. It's because you must learn to be able to acknowledge the fact that you have somewhere where you come from, but not dwell on it, and that's why it's shorter.
Yeah.
And then you've got a future that is coming, so you're not defined by where you come from. And I've always loved that story
It's a beautiful... it's a beautiful analogy, and I think, if we look at getting to the way to heal South Africa, one of the many ways, because there's no one prescription, is for people to be listening to each other's stories. I mean, we think it's as simple as that, and we already got an example of maybe 100,000 or so people are doing this in their families, etc. But one of the things that I think our young people are not listening to the stories of their parents, and a lot of people look back at 94 and say, well, Mandela sold out. Well, actually, you've got to live through that period. You've got to, I remember and you remember, we were close to civil war. Yeah. That period I was talking about, that 7-day war in Carter ANC, what I lived through in Alex, where, you know, the men's hostel, there was a war which literally, the police, I was there that night where the police and the army wouldn't come in. It was hectic. And we could have gone in two directions then. We could be sitting on ashes. We could be Ukraine. That's what could have happened to us. And so when we talk about Mandela sold out, no, actually a miracle happened. And ultimately there was compromise on every side that led to at least there being a future. We were staring, you know, as we were making that first series of Soul City, I remember thinking, because it was going through all of this violence, we were making it in that period, and thinking, God, I believe this thing, television, radio, print, this extraordinary thing. I was a young doctor. I mean, we're making this series. I don't believe that you produced it so that we're going to go into a wasteland. But I remember that period about every day wondering whether the civil war was about to start. The AWB guys in Boputa, Tswana, who were shot on the side of the road.
And were shot on public TV.
Shot on public TV. The Bishu massacre. You know, Chris Hani assassinated. You know, the times that we were
always on edge.
In the lead up to that election, where, you know, it was only 2 weeks before that Mangosuthu Buthelezi agreed to be part of that election. We were that close. And if you don't sit down with your parents and find out, what was it like living through that period? So this is part of healing our country, is to sit down with each other, to hear our stories. You know, not just our stories of then, but our stories of what it's like over the last, you know, what it's been like.
I've got a question here from, from our viewers there. It says, how can we get society to accept support and support those who are struggling with mental health, and in particular in the workplace?
Well, you know, I think we must be careful that the pendulum doesn't swing.
Okay.
So that, you know, everyone's going to have periods of stress and anxiety and not feeling great. There's a difference between a mental health issue and life.
Okay.
You know, life has its ups and downs, and we're happy and we're sad. A mental health issue is where you have a severe case of depression or anxiety or whatever. And I think it's about being able to talk about it more, and just by telling our story. But at the same time, about not focusing on so much that every time you feel low, that's mental illness.
Yes.
That's not mental illness. So we've got to differentiate what it is, what mental health is and not. So mental illness is clinical depression,
yes,
where you can't get out of bed, or where you can't, sleep for 2 nights. And we need to educate people around what mental health is,
okay,
so that we can begin
and
to have
also what it's not.
And what it's not.
Okay.
Because feeling sad or feeling anxious is part of life.
Mm-hmm.
Having a bad day, having a bad week, going through a divorce, that's part of life. Mental illness is where biologically, in the same way that asthma or diabetes or high blood pressure, I have an illness that is as worthy of treatment as diabetes or asthma or high blood pressure.
And that's intriguing. For me, it's... And the question stemming from that one is, how do we get people to actually acknowledge they're not okay? Because I see people who are just perpetually just not okay, but they don't want to go and seek another job. So it's not a question of they don't like where they work, because they like where they work, but for some reason or the other, they just never leave. They just never leave, but they also are not acknowledging that they're not okay.
Yeah.
Because you can sense it from the way they relate to other people. And how do we get people to acknowledge that they're not okay?
It's a good question, and some people are never going to acknowledge that. It's, is that old story about you can take a horse to water, but you can't make it drink, is that ultimately everybody has a decision to make. Is that, ultimately we've all got to take some ownership for our own lives. I think that's another problem we have as a country, is that everything has to be done for us. the government must do something. My workplace must do something. The workplace owes me. Actually, no. Yes, they mean, the government must be supportive, create an environment, hopefully, that is supportive of business or creating a job. But ultimately, it's still up to individuals to make the decision. We need to create the environment which makes it easier. So I can make sure I can take that horse to the water. But as individuals, I think that's something where actually we've got to take more responsibility for our own lives.
I've got a question here, and somebody has already called is saying, look, they are appreciating your code. When you help others, you're helping yourself. And the question that comes from them is, tell us more about what helping others did for you personally, and in for you to be able to recognize that you're living in a world that doesn't have everything, but you can do something about it. But what has it done for you personally, doing things for others?
Well, I think it's given purpose. Ultimately, every human being needs to have some purpose, or purposes, and I don't think there's often a singular thing, but I think doing things for others is about relationship. It's about, and you can have a purpose which is to, make 100 million rand. But that doesn't necessarily bring deep satisfaction. Whereas when you have a purpose, I'm not saying it's wrong to want to make 100 million rand, but I'm saying that because doing something for somebody else without necessarily seeking reward is about relationship. That's how we've been made. You feel good about it. I mean, the reality is that helping others, is that the way in which God has created us is that when we do reach out, and even if it's a small thing, opening the door for the old lady, picking up her bags, it's not about necessarily the big things. We feel better about who we are, and that's the way that God has made us. Cheating somebody and stealing their, taking money from them that is not yours. Maybe I've made the 100 million and made it the wrong way. But I don't feel better about myself necessarily. Whereas helping other people, even if it's in small ways, God has made us like that.
Garth, this book is incredible in the sense that you've taken a very difficult subject. And originally it was telling your story. But you also brought forward a very difficult subject. It's about being vulnerable. It's about being a lot of things. But you did it with a lot of humor. Was that with intent, or it's just the way God speaks and God writes?
Well, I also believe that if, I think one of the things is that we can take ourselves too seriously, is that our pride. And humor is one of the things, I think, that connects us as South Africans. One thing I've learnt, and my colleagues, have said to me many times, is, Garth, don't make any jokes when you go to the States, because they won't understand, and they're right. Is that humor is something that, to be able to laugh at yourself, to be able to, it's just a great leveler, It's
like the famous story of the balloon.
Yes, yeah. So, and I mean, this morning I start off by telling you I made a bubble machine for my sister's my daughter's 21st birthday, and I took a yogurt lid, and then you take those things, a little motor, and you put on the yogurt lid, and this thing goes around, and you put an ice cream container with some dishwashing liquid, and you put a fan behind it, and this goes, and it creates bubbles. And so I brought it into our offices this morning, and I put bubbles, and and then we laughed together, and not taking myself so seriously doesn't take away from, I don't think, from how people respect me. And so I think it's really important, to have a bit of a light touch with yourself, because I think we can be, I look at some of people who do take themselves very seriously, and how, they need their egos propped up. I don't know. Well, maybe it's just a personal thing, but it's not my bad.
It's not your style. But do you think as South Africans we generally take ourselves too seriously?
I don't know. I think that we think that leadership requires us to take ourselves very seriously. Whether we're political leadership or we are business leadership or church leadership, that we've got to be very serious. And yet, as much as there are things we can say about our previous president, when the things people loved most about him was when he was dancing. Mm. Now, that wasn't taking himself seriously. I mean, he's not a bad dancer, but if you think about it, because why? Because people felt that people could relate to him.
He had a connection with the people.
Yeah. And when we don't take ourselves too seriously, when we do connect with the people, and are just, the child in us comes out, and I make a bubble machine and I bring it into our offices. I have a water pistol that I keep behind my desk. Mm. That it's tradition. When you come and you work at Heartlines, I christen you. And I didn't realize, one of my colleagues pointed out, he said, "You know that you're a white guy with a gun." And this brings back memories. Oh, flip! I didn't think that one through. And I do think that there's something special about being a leader who doesn't take themselves too seriously, because that allows others. It's the same as being vulnerable with one's story.
I guess what I'm taking out of this is be much more at ease with yourself, and connect with the people a bit more, and engage all throughout, and that would be, what do they call it? God, I am so intrigued by your next project that I'm going to do something that I don't do normally. I want to give you a bit of time for you to, without me asking you the question, Garth, what's next? Because it is the ultimate question, as what do they call it? As me and you can talk until the cows come home, and it's already close to 5 o'clock and the cows are coming home. First, what's next? But I also want us to talk about this project of, what do they call it? Fathers Matter. And is that the only thing you're working on?
No, so essentially Heartlines has a range of programs. We have Values and Money, and we produce the film Nothing for Mahala.
Yes.
And as part of What's Your Story, there's a film called Beyond the River.
Yes.
And we have we're wanting to build What's Your Story. And my prayer is that millions of South Africans would begin to engage with their own story. So we continue to do that, and others. But Fathers Matter, of all the issues over the years of Soul City, which we dealt with HIV, AIDS, and domestic violence, and we dealt with some hectic issues. The issues of fatherhood and of father absence or presence has touched more people across more ages, races, economic backgrounds than any other issue I've ever come across. The father wound is deep in our society. And so Fathers Matter, what we do always when we're looking at something, and we what we're doing with Fathers Matter is promoting the active, positive presence of men in the lives of children. And both of those words are important. You can be present in the life of your child without being active. A lot of fathers are there, but they're not there. You can be present, but destructive. You can be breaking up the family. You can be abusing. So active, present, important. But the first thing we always do is try and understand why so many men aren't present. And the thing that the media will tell you is that they're deadbeat dads. They're the guys who, they just don't pay maintenance. They're not anywhere to be seen. Mm-hmm. And so we went and we spent a year understanding this problem. And the vast majority of the issues is, and this is where we've always got to start when we're wanting to change things, is we're wanting to understand what are the obstacles to change? What's standing in the way? So what's standing in the way of men being there? And there are 5 things. But the first thing and the most important is that both men and importantly women understand that men need to provide financially. And if you can't provide financially, then what use are you? And we're sitting with unemployment as it is. Men feel useless if they can't provide. And women, we have a lovely quote that says, if he can't bring money into the house, I don't need another child in the home. So a lot of the reasons why men are not present is because they don't feel that they have a role because they are not employed. The other thing is that in certain cultures, the issues of inklaulo and of lobola, where price is not being paid, the wife, the mother's family often is a barrier between the man being present. The other thing is understanding. If I said to you, Tsepo, are mothers important? Do mothers matter? You'd say to me, dude, are you stupid? Yes. If we said to the vast majority of people, is it important for children if they are brought up with an active, positive presence of a man? It can be a grandfather, an uncle. They will say, yeah, maybe. The research is so compelling that it's a risk for children, that they are much higher risk of being a victim or a perpetrator of violence. So 90% of males in our jails who are there for murder, for robbery, for violence, have come out of father-absent homes. In the US, 90% of men in jail come from homes like that. You're much more likely to be a victim of violence, either as a man or a woman, or a victim of child abuse in a father-absent home. You're much more likely to be a victim of mental illness, of substance abuse, of suicide, of poor educational outcomes. So we want to get across this thing of, so this is the background. What are we doing about it? There's going to be 6 films on the SABC, hopefully in October, 6 weeks, where SABC 1, 2, and 3 will run these films. We'll have discussion programs out on all 11 language stations. We want to bring corporate South Africa along, just to focus on, not that women don't matter, but it's good for women if men are more involved in childcare. It liberates women. If a man is more involved, I love the story you told me about being able to phone your son. You said to me, I phoned my son, I was in Sishan. I phoned my son and he couldn't sleep, and I just was on the phone, and then he was able to sleep. We need to get that message out. And then we have a program called Connect Groups, where men are supporting men. You can go to our website, fathersmatter.org.za, and get involved.
Garth, it's been a riveting afternoon. I think the best I could ever advise people to do is go out there, buy the book, and let's continue to tell our story. As South Africans, we've struggled quite a lot with a lot of things. We've struggled with the difficulty to tell our stories, and Garth breaks it down in its simplest form and allows us to be able to say, well, if you could tell your story, you'll be able to get to your own trauma and understand it, and then by itself, we can break so-called generational curses and all sorts of other things that we've called it, but it's just because people never told their story. All that's left for me to do, Garth, is first pay the bill, to thank Ben McMillan for allowing us to work with them and work with you and have the conversation about the book. The leadership in this company that continues to be behind us in the endeavor that we had taken on in early 2020 and 2021, and we've gotten it this far, and continue to be behind it through all of that. To all the people that put all of this together, I think one of the things that I've learned to do is be grateful for the people that do the work that they do. So for our team in knowledge management, the team in marketing, and everybody else who supports all of these endeavors, and those who've come before us, and those that we've lost that have been a great part of, what do they call it, of what we do here. Thank you, thank you, thank you. From me, Stogolo Samatevele, Lemapulana, it's been a great afternoon. Thank you.